July 4th, 1187. The hills above the Sea of Galilee. 20,000 Christian knights and infantry stumble across a waterless wasteland under the scorching summer sun. Their throats are parched, their lips cracked, their armor burns against their skin. They've been marching for 2 days without water. The enemy has poisoned every well. Smoke from burning grass chokes their lungs. And on every hill, Muslim cavalry circles like wolves watching wounded prey. This is the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the largest Crusader force ever assembled in the Holy Land. The finest knights in Christendom, veterans of countless battles, defenders of the holiest sites in Christianity. And they're walking into a trap. Ahead lie the twin peaks called the Horns of Hattin. Behind them, any hope of retreat to water is cut off by Saladin's army. Around them, thousands of mounted archers rain arrows from distances their own weapons can't reach. By sunset, this army will cease to exist. The Kingdom of Jerusalem will fall. The true cross, the holiest relic in Christendom, believed to be wood from Christ's actual cross, will be captured. And within 3 months, Jerusalem itself will surrender to Muslim forces. It will be the greatest Christian military disaster since the fall of Rome. A defeat so complete, so devastating, that it will trigger the Third Crusade and bring Richard the Lionheart himself to the Holy Land. But it didn't have to happen. Every step toward this catastrophe was a choice, a series of decisions rooted in pride, arrogance, and the fatal belief that God would grant victory simply because the cause was righteous. Today, we're going to explore one of history's most important battles. Not just the military tactics and the strategic failures, but the spiritual lessons embedded in this tragedy. We'll meet the key players, Saladin, the Muslim Sultan whose brilliance and mercy would earn respect even from his enemies. Guy de Lusignan, the weak king who made every wrong decision. Renaud de Chatillon, whose brutality and arrogance provoked the war. And Raymond of Tripoli, who saw the disaster coming but couldn't prevent it. We'll trace the events leading to Hattin, the provocations, the strategic situation, the fatal decisions that doomed the Crusader army before the battle even began. We'll examine the battle itself, hour by hour, as heat and thirst and tactical brilliance destroyed the most powerful Christian army in the East. And we'll discover what this battle reveals about pride, presumption, the danger of confusing God's will with our own desires, and how even devastating defeat can be part of God's larger purposes. Stay with me until the end, because this isn't just medieval history. This is a warning, a lesson about what happens when faith becomes arrogance, when confidence in God's favor turns into presumption that God must give us victory regardless of our actions. The Crusaders at Hattin believed God was on their side. They were wrong about what that meant. Let's dive in. To understand the Battle of Hattin, we first need to understand what the Crusaders had built in the century since the First Crusade, and why it was all about to collapse. In 1099, the First Crusade culminated in the conquest of Jerusalem. Against impossible odds, through battles and sieges and a brutal 2,000-mile march, the Crusaders had captured the Holy City. In the aftermath, they established what became known as the Crusader States, 4 territories stretching along the eastern Mediterranean coast: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was the crown jewel. It included not just the Holy City, but also vital ports like Acre and Jaffa, fortresses like Kerak and Montreal, and agricultural lands that could support a Christian population. By 1187, nearly 90 years after its founding, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had become a unique hybrid culture. Crusader knights had married local Christian women. Children were born who had never seen Europe. French, Italian, and German settlers had adapted to Eastern life. They were called the poulains, the colts, by newly arriving crusaders from Europe. They dressed in Eastern styles. They ate Eastern food. They spoke Arabic alongside French and Latin. They understood their Muslim neighbors in ways the newcomers never would. This created tension. The poulains knew they had to coexist with Muslim neighbors. They negotiated treaties. They formed alliances. They understood that total war meant mutual destruction. But the newly arrived crusaders saw compromise as weakness. They had come to fight for Christ. They wanted conquest, not coexistence. They saw the poulains as corrupted, too comfortable, insufficiently zealous. This tension would prove fatal. The kingdom was also facing a demographic crisis. There simply weren't enough Europeans willing to settle in the east. The Crusader population was tiny compared to the Muslim populations surrounding them. Historians estimate that in 1187, the Kingdom of Jerusalem had perhaps 120,000 Christian inhabitants, of whom only 20,000 were European Franks capable of military service. They were surrounded by Muslim populations in the millions. The kingdom's survival depended on several factors: strong fortifications, superior heavy cavalry, division among Muslim powers, and careful diplomacy to avoid uniting their enemies. For decades, this worked. Muslim Egypt was often at war with Muslim Syria. Local emirs made truces with the Crusaders. The balance of power held. But then Saladin changed everything. Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, was born in 1137 or 1138 in Tikrit, in modern-day Iraq. He was Kurdish by ethnicity, a professional soldier by training, and a devout Sunni Muslim by faith. He rose to prominence in Egypt, eventually overthrowing the Fatimid Caliphate and establishing himself as Sultan. Then, he turned his attention to Syria, uniting various Muslim territories under his control. By the 1180s, Saladin had accomplished what Crusader strategists had feared for decades. He controlled both Egypt to the south and Syria to the north. The Crusader states were caught in a vice. Saladin was brilliant, patient, and driven by a vision of jihad, holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from the Crusaders. But he was also pragmatic. He knew the Crusaders' heavy cavalry was formidable. He knew their castles were nearly impregnable. He couldn't simply attack head-on. So he waited. He built his forces. He unified Muslim territories. And he watched for his opportunity. That opportunity came from an unlikely source, a Crusader noble whose brutality and arrogance would hand Saladin the justification he needed to launch total war. His name was Renaud de Chatillon, and he was, by any measure, a disaster for the Crusader cause. Renaud de Chatillon was a French knight who had arrived in the Holy Land during the Second Crusade in 1147. He was ambitious, ruthless, and utterly without political sense. Through marriage, he became Prince of Antioch. He launched raids into Christian Byzantine territory, attacking fellow Christians, which enraged both the Byzantines and his own Crusader allies. He was eventually captured by Muslims and spent 16 years in prison. When he was finally released in 1176, he married into wealth again, becoming Lord of Kerak and Outre-Jourdain, territories that controlled the roads between Damascus and Egypt. These territories were strategically vital and incredibly wealthy from taxing trade caravans. Renaud had signed truces with Saladin, but he ignored them. Repeatedly, he raided Muslim caravans traveling under safe passage agreements. He attacked pilgrims heading to Mecca. He even launched an audacious raid into the Red Sea, threatening the holy cities of Mecca and Medina themselves. These weren't military operations. They were piracy, banditry, violations of sworn agreements. And they enraged Saladin. Worse, Renaud captured Saladin's sister in one of these raids. Some sources say He threatened to attack Mecca itself. Whether this is true or propaganda, it had the same effect. Saladin vowed to personally execute Reynaud. The king of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, was supposed to control his vassals. But Guy was weak. He couldn't or wouldn't stop Reynaud's provocations. And so Saladin had his justification. Reynaud had broken the truce. The Crusaders could not be trusted. It was time for jihad. In the spring of 1187, Saladin called his emirs together. He assembled the largest Muslim army yet gathered against the Crusader states. Sources estimate between 20,000 and 30,000 troops, cavalry, infantry, and light horse archers. His plan was brilliant in its simplicity. He would invade the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He would force the Crusaders to gather their entire army to meet him. And then he would destroy that army in a single battle. If he could eliminate the Crusader field army, the castles would fall one by one. The kingdom would collapse. Jerusalem would be his. But first, he needed to provoke the Crusaders into making a fatal mistake. And that's exactly what he did. King Guy de Lusignan was in an impossible position. He was not a strong leader. He had only become king through his marriage to Queen Sibylla, and many nobles questioned his authority. His court was divided between two factions. The Hawks, led by Reynaud de Chatillon and Gerard de Riedfort, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, advocated aggressive action. They believed that faith and courage would bring victory, that God would grant success to those bold enough to attack his enemies. The Doves, led by Raymond of Tripoli, advocated caution. Raymond was one of the Poulains, born in the East, fluent in Arabic, experienced in dealing with Muslim powers. He knew Saladin's strength. He knew the Crusaders' weaknesses. He knew that marching out to meet Saladin on ground of Saladin's choosing was suicide. Raymond had even negotiated a personal truce with Saladin, which made the Hawks distrust him. Some accused him of treason, of being too friendly with Muslims, of putting self-interest above the Christian cause. In early July 1187, Saladin made his move. He crossed the Jordan River with his army and laid siege to Tiberias, a fortress town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias was held by Raymond of Tripoli's wife, Ashiva. She was trapped inside with a small garrison, while Saladin's army surrounded the town. This created an impossible dilemma for the Crusaders. If they marched to relieve Tiberias, they would have to cross waterless terrain in the height of summer. If they didn't march, they would abandon a Christian fortress to the enemy, and Raymond's wife to captivity or death. The Crusader army assembled at Sepphoris, about 16 miles west of Tiberias. Springs there provided abundant water. It was a strong defensive position. If Saladin wanted to attack the Crusader army, he would have to come to them, leaving Tiberias behind and marching toward a well-watered, well-defended position. Raymond of Tripoli, whose own wife was besieged at Tiberias, stood in the war council and argued against marching. "My lords," he said, according to contemporary chronicles, "the Tiberias is my city and my wife is there. No one has more reason than I to want to relieve it. But I tell you, we must not march. Saladin wants us to leave this position. He wants us to march across waterless terrain in the heat. He wants us exhausted and thirsty when we fight. If we stay here, he must either attack us in a strong position or withdraw. If we march, we walk into a trap." He even said, "Better to lose Tiberias than to lose the kingdom. The fortress can be rebuilt. If we lose this army, the kingdom falls." It was sound military advice. Every experienced commander in the room knew it. But Gerard de Riedfort, the Grand Master of the Templars, accused Raymond of cowardice, of putting his personal interests, saving his wife, above the kingdom, of being too friendly with Muslims to want to fight them. "Are we to sit here and do nothing while Christians are besieged?" Gerard demanded. "Where is our faith? Where is our courage? God will grant us victory. This is the danger of spiritualizing military decisions, of confusing faith with presumption, of believing that good intentions guarantee divine intervention. King Guy was torn. That night, after the council, Gerard came to him privately and pressed the case for marching. He appealed to Guy's honor, his courage, his faith, and Guy made the fatal decision. At dawn on July 3, 1187, the Crusader army broke camp at Sepphoris and began marching east toward Tiberias. They were marching to their destruction. The army that left Sepphoris that morning was the largest Crusader force ever assembled in the East. Contemporary sources vary, but most modern historians estimate approximately 20,000 men. This included about 200 heavily armored knights, the cream of European chivalry. These were men in full chainmail, riding massive war horses, armed with lances and swords. In a charge, they were devastating. They could smash through infantry formations like a hammer through glass. There were also the military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These were professional warriors who had taken religious vows. They were disciplined, experienced, and fanatical in their dedication to defending the Holy Land. Supporting the knights were about 18,000 infantry, sergeants, crossbowmen, and light infantry. Many of these were local Christians, Syrians, and Armenians who served the Crusader lords. The army also carried the true cross, the holiest relic in the kingdom, believed to be wood from the actual cross on which Jesus was crucified. Its presence was meant to inspire the troops and guarantee God's favor. But this massive army had one critical vulnerability: water. The march from Sepphoris to Tiberias was only about 16 miles. In Europe, an easy day's march. But this was July in the Jordan Valley. Temperatures could reach 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The terrain was largely waterless, and the army was marching in full armor. There was one water source along the route, the Springs of Turan, about 6 miles from Sepphoris. If the army could reach the springs by the first night, camp there, and push on to Tiberias the next morning, the plan could work. But Saladin had anticipated this. He sent light cavalry to harass the Crusader column from the moment it left Sepphoris. Muslim horse archers rode close, shot volleys of arrows, and retreated before the Crusader heavy cavalry could engage. The arrows didn't do much damage against armor, but they slowed the march. They forced the Crusaders to maintain formation. They created constant pressure and tension. More importantly, Saladin had cavalry positioned to block access to the springs of Turan. The Crusaders found themselves in a running battle just to reach water. The march slowed. The heat intensified. Men began to collapse. Horses died. By afternoon, the Crusader vanguard, the leading element of the army, had reached the springs. But the main body of the army was strung out behind them, still miles away. Raymond of Tripoli, commanding the vanguard, sent word back to King Guy, "We must stop at the springs. The army must rest and water here. If we push on now, we'll reach Tiberias too exhausted to fight." But Gerard de Rochefort sent opposite advice. "If we stop now, we show weakness. We must push forward. Tiberias is only 10 miles ahead. We can make it." Guy made another fatal decision. He ordered the army to push past the springs without stopping. This meant that thousands of men, already suffering from heat and thirst, passed within sight of water without being allowed to drink. Imagine the psychological torture. Imagine watching water flow while your throat burns and your lips crack, and you're forbidden to stop. Morale shattered. Discipline began to break down. Men started dropping out of formation to search for water. Commanders had to threaten soldiers to keep them moving. By late afternoon, it was clear the army couldn't reach Tiberias before nightfall. They were exhausted. They were dying of thirst. They were under constant arrow attack. Guy ordered the army to camp for the night at a location near the twin hills called the Horns of Hattin. These were extinct volcanic cones rising above the plateau. There was no water there, but there was nowhere else to go. As the Crusaders made camp, Saladin's army surrounded them. Muslim forces controlled every approach. They controlled every water source. They had the Crusaders exactly where they wanted them. That night was torment. Soldiers and horses went without water. Saladin's troops set fire to dry brush, and smoke blew into the Crusader camp. Men choked and coughed all night. Some tried to break out to find water and were cut down by Muslim cavalry. Contemporary chroniclers record that some Crusaders tried to surrender that night, so desperate were they for water. Muslim sources describe Crusader soldiers offering gold for a drink. By dawn on July 4th, the Crusader army was already broken. They hadn't even fought yet, and they'd lost. Saladin's tactical genius had turned the march itself into a weapon. At dawn on July 4th, 1187, the Crusaders faced an impossible situation. They were surrounded. They were desperate for water. Their horses were dying. Their men were collapsing. And Saladin's army was fresh, well-watered, and ready. King Guy called a council. Raymond of Tripoli, whose advice to stay at Sepphoris had been ignored, whose warnings about this exact situation had been dismissed, made one final plea. "My lords, we must break through to the springs at Hattin." These springs were a few miles north, down the slope of the plateau. "If we can fight our way there, we can water the army and make a stand." It was the only hope, a desperate gamble. But without water, they would die where they stood. The army formed up. The plan was for Raymond's vanguard to charge north, break through the Muslim lines, and open a corridor to the springs. The main body of the army would follow. Raymond led his knights in a thundering charge down the slope. The Muslims saw them coming, and they did something unexpected. They parted. They opened a gap in their lines and let Raymond's cavalry charge through. It's unclear if this was intentional, a tactical decision to let Raymond escape and divide the Crusader army, or if Raymond's charge was simply so fierce they couldn't stop it. Either way, Raymond and his knights broke through. They reached the springs, but behind them, the Muslim lines closed again. The rest of the Crusader army was cut off. Raymond was free, but he'd abandoned the army. Did he have a choice? Could he have fought his way back? Did he intentionally flee, or did he simply execute the plan and expect the rest of the army to follow? We'll never know for certain. Raymond survived the battle and lived another few months before dying. Some say of grief and shame at the disaster. But for the rest of the Crusader army, trapped on the plateau, his departure was devastating. Their best commander was gone. Their vanguard was gone. And they were surrounded. King Guy ordered the army to fight its way to the Horns of Hattin, the twin peaks that dominated the plateau. At least from high ground, they could make a defensive stand. What followed was slaughter. Muslim cavalry circled the Crusader formations, staying out of lance range, but close enough for archery. Thousands of arrows rained down. Horses died. Unarmored infantry died. The arrows couldn't penetrate heavy knight armor, but they didn't need to. They just needed to wound, to harry, to demoralize. Meanwhile, smoke from burning brush choked the Crusaders. The heat was unbearable. Men collapsed from dehydration before they could fight. The heavy cavalry, the Crusaders' most powerful weapon, was useless. Horses were too exhausted and thirsty to charge effectively. And even when knights did charge, the light Muslim cavalry simply retreated, maintaining distance, never letting the Crusaders close for hand-to-hand combat where their armor and weapons gave them advantage. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Psychological warfare, tactical brilliance. The Crusader infantry broke first. Thousands of men, desperate for water, threw down their weapons, and tried to surrender. Many were cut down. Others were captured. The knights fought on. They were professionals. They were disciplined. They were brave. But courage couldn't overcome heat, thirst, and tactical disaster. The army contracted toward the horns of Hattin. They climbed the slopes. They formed defensive positions. The true cross was planted at the top, the holiest relic in Christendom, now surrounded by dying men. Saladin ordered a final assault. Muslim forces stormed the slopes. Hand-to-hand combat erupted across the hillside. By midday, it was over. King Guy de Lusignan was captured. The true cross was captured. The Grand Masters of the Templars and Hospitallers were captured. Reynaud de Chatillon was captured. Of the 20,000 men who had marched from Sepphoris, only a few thousand escaped. Most were killed or captured. The military orders were nearly wiped out. Sources say 230 Templars and Hospitallers were executed after the battle. The Kingdom of Jerusalem no longer had an army. The kingdom was defenseless. After the battle, the prisoners were brought before Saladin. King Guy was given water, a sign in Arab culture that his life would be spared. Saladin treated him with courtesy despite his defeat. But when Reynaud de Chatillon was brought forward, the atmosphere changed. Saladin reminded Reynaud of his crime, the broken truces, the attacks on pilgrims, the raid toward Mecca, the insults to Islam. He offered Reynaud a chance to convert to Islam. Reynaud refused. Saladin drew his own sword and struck Reynaud, either killing him or wounding him severely before guards finished him. It was personal. Saladin had sworn to kill Reynaud with his own hand, and he kept his oath. King Guy, watching this, thought he was next. But Saladin reassured him, "A king does not kill a king." But that man, pointing to Reynaud's body, overstepped every boundary. The true cross, captured from the battlefield, was sent to Damascus and paraded through the streets upside down, a deliberate humiliation. The Templar and Hospitaller prisoners were offered the same choice as Reynaud: convert or die. Nearly all refused. They were executed en masse. Saladin viewed the military orders not as soldiers, but as fanatics who would never make peace. Better to eliminate them than to release them to fight again. But regular soldiers and nobles who could pay ransom were generally treated well. Saladin's mercy was strategic. He wanted to encourage surrender, not desperate last stands. Within weeks, Saladin's army swept through the kingdom. Town after town surrendered. Castle after castle fell. By September 1187, Saladin stood outside Jerusalem itself. The city was full of refugees. There was no army to defend it. Resistance was futile. But the defenders prepared to fight anyway. Balian of Ibelin, one of the few nobles to escape Hattin, organized the defense. He knighted every boy over 16 to swell the ranks. He melted down church silver to pay soldiers. Saladin laid siege. His siege engines battered the walls. On October 2, 1187, a breach was made. But Saladin didn't order an assault. He offered terms. He remembered 1099. When the first Crusaders captured Jerusalem, they had massacred the Muslim and Jewish population. Blood ran in the streets. It was genocide. Saladin didn't want to repeat that atrocity. He offered to let the Christians leave safely if they paid a ransom. 10 dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, 1 for a child. Many couldn't pay, but Saladin released them anyway. Sources say he freed thousands without ransom. His brother Al-Adil begged for 1,000 slaves as a gift, then immediately freed them. When Christian chroniclers, who had every reason to demonize Saladin, wrote about the fall of Jerusalem, many acknowledged his mercy. He protected the Christians. He allowed them to leave with dignity. He prevented a massacre. It was a stark contrast to 1099, and it raised uncomfortable questions for Christians. Why had the Crusaders massacred when they took Jerusalem, while Saladin showed mercy when he recaptured it? The fall of Jerusalem shocked Christian Europe. The Pope nearly died of grief when he heard the news. Plans immediately began for a new crusade. What became the Third Crusade would bring Europe's greatest kings to the Holy Land: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. But that's another story. For now, the disaster at Hattin was complete. An entire kingdom lost in a single day because of pride, poor decisions, and the fatal belief that God would grant victory regardless of tactics or wisdom. So what can we learn from the catastrophe at Hattin? What spiritual lessons emerge from this devastating defeat? First, faith is not a substitute for wisdom. The Crusader hawks believed that faith and courage would guarantee victory. They thought that because their cause was righteous, defending the Holy Land, God would ensure success. But God doesn't reward foolishness. He doesn't bless presumption. Faith without wisdom is not faith. It's arrogance disguised as spirituality. Proverbs 21:5 says, "The plans of the diligent lead to profit, as surely as haste leads to poverty." The Crusaders rushed into battle without adequate preparation, without securing water, without proper tactics, and they paid the price. Faith says, "I trust God to be with me." Presumption says, "I don't need to plan because God will do it for me." The Crusaders confused the two, and it destroyed them. Second, pride goes before destruction. Reynald de Chatillon's arrogance provoked the war. Gerard de Riedfort's pride wouldn't let him admit Raymond was right. King Guy's pride made him susceptible to accusations of cowardice. Proverbs 16:18 warns, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." The Crusaders fell not because they lacked faith, but because they had too much pride. They believed they couldn't lose. They ignored sound advice because admitting someone else was right would wound their ego. Pride makes us unteachable. It makes us reject wisdom because accepting it means admitting we were wrong. Third, God uses even pagan rulers to accomplish his purposes. Saladin was not a Christian. He was a devout Muslim who wanted to drive the Crusaders from the Holy Land. Yet in taking Jerusalem, he showed more mercy and compassion than the Crusaders had shown 88 years earlier. God had used Cyrus, a pagan Persian king, to free Israel from Babylon. He used Nebuchadnezzar to judge Israel's sins. He uses whoever he chooses to accomplish his will. The fact that Saladin defeated the Crusaders doesn't mean God was against Christianity. It means God's purposes are larger than we understand. And sometimes he uses our enemies to teach us lessons we refuse to learn from friends. Fourth, spiritual failure often leads to military failure. The Crusader kingdom was plagued by political division, personal ambition, and spiritual compromise. The military orders, founded to be monks and warriors, had become wealthy and political. The nobility fought among themselves for power. When spiritual foundations crumble, everything else follows. The kingdom fell not just because of one bad battle, but because the spiritual and moral rot had been growing for decades. Fifth, mercy triumphs over judgment. The Crusaders massacred Jerusalem in 1099. Saladin showed mercy in 1187. History remembers which action was more Christ-like. James 2:13 says, "Mercy triumphs over judgment." The greatest Muslim general in history showed more of Christ's character than the Christian warriors. That should humble us. That should make us examine our own hearts. Sixth, defeat is not always punishment. Sometimes it's redirection. The loss of Jerusalem forced European Christians to reconsider the Crusades. It led to soul-searching, repentance, and renewed commitment to faith. God sometimes allows defeat to wake us up, to show us we've been trusting in our own strength, to redirect us to his purposes rather than our own. Seventh, the battle is the Lord's, but we still must fight wisely. This is the balance. We trust God for victory, But we don't presume God will make up for our foolishness. David said, "The battle is the Lord's." But he still chose 5 smooth stones and aimed carefully. He trusted God and used his skill. The Crusaders trusted God but ignored basic military wisdom. That's not faith. That's presumption. And presumption leads to disaster. So here we are, July 4th, 1187. The horns of Hattin, the greatest Christian army in the East, destroyed in a single day. Not by superior numbers, the armies were roughly equal in size. Not by superior courage, the Crusader knights fought bravely to the end. Not even by superior weapons, the Crusader heavy cavalry was still the most powerful military force of the age. They lost because of pride, because of bad decisions, because they confused faith with presumption, because they believed God's favor meant they didn't need wisdom. And the result was catastrophic. A kingdom lost, Jerusalem fallen, the true cross captured, thousands dead. But even in defeat, there are lessons. Lessons about humility, about listening to wise counsel, about the difference between faith and presumption, about mercy being stronger than vengeance. Saladin won the battle, but Christian Europe learned from the defeat. The Third Crusade that followed would show a different approach, more strategic, more careful, more respectful of both Muslim opponents and military wisdom. And in the larger scope of history, the Crusades would eventually end. Both Christians and Muslims would learn, slowly and painfully, that coexistence serves God's purposes better than endless holy war. Now I want to ask you, what battles have you lost because you confused faith with presumption? What disasters have you walked into because pride wouldn't let you listen to wise counsel? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Not to shame yourself, but to learn. Because the same God who allowed Hattin to teach the Crusaders humility uses our defeats to teach us as well. And if you want to see how another Christian army learned from defeat and came back stronger, click on the video you see on your screen right now. We're going to explore Richard the Lionheart versus Saladin, the Third Crusade. You'll discover how Richard learned from the mistakes at Hattin, how he and Saladin developed mutual respect, and how sometimes God's purposes are served not by total victory, but by honorable stalemate. Don't miss it, because the story that began at Hattin continues with Richard and Saladin, 2 of history's greatest warriors, learning to respect each other even across the divide of faith. Remember, faith is not presumption. Wisdom is not weakness. And sometimes our greatest defeats become our most important lessons. Blessings.